Welcome. Thanks for being here. I once bought a man a bottle of something French and watched him hold it like it might go off. So I did what I'd been trained to do. I told him it was aftershave. It wasn't aftershave. It was perfume, and I lied to his face to let him wear it. And I've been thinking about that lie for 30 years, because nobody says this about the men of the golden age. They didn't wear perfume. They would sooner have worn a corset. What they wore was an alibi. Aftershave, cologne, bay rum, hair tonic, the whole barbershop economy, all of it the same alcohol in the same molecules as a woman's eau de toilette, renamed so no man had to confess he was scenting himself for pleasure. Today, I'm taking 5 of the biggest men the movies ever made and using each one to open a door onto one of the 5 forces that built that lie. The alibi wasn't vanity. It was assembled by psychology, by politics, by money, by class, and by the censor. And every one of those 5 has a face you already know. I policed this for most of my life without noticing. I bought the men in my life cologne every Christmas and never once called it perfume, because calling it perfume would have embarrassed both of us. And the not embarrassing was my job. I kept the lie tidy. The lie is this: perfume is for seduction, so perfume is for women. Aftershave is for hygiene, so aftershave is for men. Except it is the same bottle. It's often the same juice in a more rectangular flask, and the entire male fragrance industry of the 20th century is one long act of plausible deniability dressed up as grooming. He was not perfuming himself, he was finishing the shave. He was being clean. He was being a man about it. The great male stars, the faces we still use to mean masculinity, were the most heavily alibied of all, because they had the most to lose if the lie cracked. So when you ask what they wore, you are asking what they were willing to admit. Those are 2 different questions, and the gap between them is the episode. This is the alibi. First, the rule they were all living under, because everything hangs from it, and it wasn't subtle. A man could be clean. A man could be fragrant. Clean was discipline, and discipline was masculine. Fragrant was pleasure, and pleasure taken in your own body, applied with your own hand, in front of a mirror, was a thing the culture had handed to women, and to men it had other words for. The vocabulary gives the game away. A woman wore scent. A man splashed something on. She dabbed, he slapped, and the verbs were built to drain the sensuality out of the gesture, because the gesture was identical and only the verbs could keep them apart. So the industry did the men a favor. It gave them categories to hide in, and aftershave was the great one because it bolted the fragrance to an unimpeachable chore. No man chooses aftershave to smell good. He chooses it because he's shaved, and if it leaves him smelling of bay and clover and bitter orange for 9 hours, well, that is a side effect of being well-groomed. Cologne, hair tonic, bay rum, the barbershop splash, every one of them a room a man could stand in and say, truthfully, I'm not wearing perfume. The barbershop was the temple of the arrangement because it let another man apply it. That is the deepest part of the alibi. Someone else put it on you as a service, so you were never caught choosing it for yourself. The hand that scented the mid-century man was not allowed to be his own. Now, the 5 forces that built that rule and the 5 men who carry each one. Steve McQueen wore nothing. That is not a gap in my research, it's the finding. By his first wife's account, the king of cool, the most envied male body of the 1960s, wore no fragrance at all. Nothing on the skin, nothing on the collar. A deliberately blank scent profile. To see why a man would armor himself in nothing, look at what the movies were doing to the male body at that moment. They were opening it. A new naturalistic male star walked onto the screen, sweating, tender, half undone. Brando in A Streetcar Named Desire in 1951. James Dean in Rebel Without a Cause in 55. Montgomery Clift. Men allowed to be wounded and looked at and desired in a way Clark Gable had never had to be. The audience for that wound was a generation of ordinary men who'd just been handed 2 pieces of bad news. Kinsey, in 1948, told them their own desires were stranger than they would admit out loud. And Playboy, in 53, arrived to sell them a safe, sophisticated way to be men again. And the man in the grey flannel suit in 56 put Gregory Peck on the screen as the hollow company man and asked, in front of everybody, what he was for. The more nakedly the screen modelled male feeling, the harder the man in the seat armoured himself against it. He didn't reach for sensuality, he reached for clean. Old Spice, the aftershave splash, scent as antiseptic, a way of smelling scrubbed rather than desired. A way of saying, I have a body, but I've disinfected it. The purest, coldest version of that retreat reached for nothing at all. And McQueen is the apotheosis of the alibi, because he didn't even need the bottle. He took the deniability down to 0. The cool we still sell on posters was, read another way, a man so frightened of his own interior that he sealed it shut and let us call the silence style. He gave us nothing to smell, because smell is involuntary. Smell is the body confessing, and a man who confesses nothing is a man you cannot get at. And then he died, and we could not leave the silence alone. Decades later, a cologne went on sale with his name on it, built to a brief, and I'm quoting, of warm earth and motor oil and enormous sensuality. They scented the idea of him. They took a man who wore nothing and sold the public a fan fiction about how he would have smelled if he'd let himself be smelled. The psychology was never only his. It was ours. We couldn't bear that our coolest man had sealed himself off, so we unsealed him after death and bottled the version we wished he'd been, and the movies kept showing the wound. The man in the seat answered with disinfectant or with nothing to prove the wound wasn't his. Cary Grant wore Acqua di Parma cologne, a cologne from 1916. Italian and the most beautifully tailored alibi on the list. It opens bright and immaculate, neroli and Sicilian citrus over lavender and rosemary, a clean, aromatic, aristocratic shave splash with not one vulgar bone in it, and it was made to scent gentlemen's handkerchiefs. Elegance with a cast iron excuse built in, and it belonged to the most invented man the movies had ever produced. There was no Cary Grant. There was a poor boy from Bristol named Archibald Leach, who built him from nothing. The accent, the tan, the tailoring, the ease, a performance of effortless masculinity, so convincing it erased the boy who made it. Every inch assembled by hand. The rumours followed him for life, the years sharing a house with Randolph Scott, the whispers about what he was underneath, the most polished surface in Hollywood. I am not delivering a verdict on Cary Grant's private life, and that is the point. In the 1950s, the verdict was never the danger. The suspicion was. Through the 50s, the federal government ran what we now call the Lavender Scare. In 1953, President Eisenhower signed Executive Order 10450, which barred gay men and lesbians from federal employment outright. And somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000 people lost their jobs over the following years for who they were suspected of being. Suspected, not proven. In that climate, to be a certain kind of man, refined, fragrant, too interested in his own surface, was not a question of taste. It was a security category. The movies couldn't discuss it because the production code forbade depicting what it called sexual perversion. So the only refined men allowed on screen were the coded ones, the villain with exquisite manners, the aesthete you were taught to distrust. Refinement itself got painted as suspect. So look again at Grant's choice, the most looked at man of the age. One rumour never left alone, reaches for a cologne of pure aristocratic polish that happens to carry an excuse sewn into the seams. A handkerchief splash, a grooming product, nothing to see. Acqua di Parma let him smell as exquisite as he looked, while keeping, on the label, an airtight excuse. The deniability wasn't vanity. In 1953, for a man the culture was already squinting at, it was a way of staying employable, respectable, castable, safe. This is the force people forget because it has a body count. The alibi, at its hardest edge, was never about a man too embarrassed to smell nice. It was about keeping the state, the studio, and the gossip columnist on the far side of a line he couldn't afford to cross. He wore the beautiful thing. He kept the excuse to hand, and he never said the word. Frank Sinatra wore Yardley, English lavender. Lavender, a cool, clean, sober lavender. Yardley of London had been making since the 1870s the scent your grandmother kept in a drawer with the good linen. Both his daughters name it in their memoirs. The only reason we know was because Sinatra was never going to sit for an interview about his lavender. He carries the economic force because he's the man who survived the thing that killed old Hollywood by turning himself into a business. And what killed it was a law. In 1948, the Supreme Court decided the paramount antitrust case and forced the studios to sell off the cinemas they owned. That, with the de Havilland ruling of 44 that had already cracked open the 7-year contract and television in the suburbs, emptying the movie palaces, put the whole Star Factory down across the next decade. The Star Factory was exactly that, a machine that manufactured a man's image and told the public who he was. And Clark Gable is what that machine produced, the king. MGM built him. MGM owned him. MGM told you he was the most masculine man alive, and he wore a drugstore Coty Chypre because the king didn't need to reach for status. The studios supplied it. Gable was a studio god, and he died in 1960 as the system that made him finished dying too. He is the before. Sinatra is the after. The studio dropped him at his lowest, and instead of vanishing, he rebuilt himself as his own enterprise, the comeback in From Here to Eternity in 1953, then his own label, Reprise in 1960, then Vegas, the Rat Pack, a Sinatra Corporation with Sinatra as sole shareholder. He didn't wait for a studio to manufacture his image. He manufactured it himself, and he kept the rights. Sinatra is the first modern celebrity, a man who is his own brand, and the lavender is the tulle, the one fixed loyalty at the center of all that self-production, the grandmother's drawer he went home to. This is where it reaches your own shelf. As the studios stopped manufacturing male images, someone had to pack up the work, because the desire to be told who you were didn't leave when MGM did. The consumer counter picked it up, and the war had just taught a generation of men to use grooming products in uniform, and they came home as customers, and the men's toiletries business that had barely existed in the 1940s became a boom. The fragrance counter inherited the job the studio publicity department had dropped, selling a man an image of himself. The saint making didn't stop. It moved from the back lot to the department store, and it has been there ever since. The machine that made the male star fell apart. The star learned to make himself, and the counter learned to sell every other man the same trick in a bottle. Elvis Presley wore Old Spice. According to Priscilla, the favorite was Old Spice, the Shilton drugstore staple from the late 1930s, the clove and orange barbershop scent that sat on 1,000,000 ordinary bathroom shelves next to 1,000,000 ordinary razors. He ran through Brut too, and Canoe. The body the country worshipped smelled of the cheapest honest bottle in the shop. Elvis was the everyman raised to a god, and the scent had to keep the everyman in the god, or the trick didn't work. This was the age of the company man and the conformist. The Lonely Crowd in 1950, The Organization Man in 56, the grey flannel suit as a uniform of fitting in, the suburb, the GI Bill, and a brand new animal nobody had marketed to before, the teenager with money in his pocket. The exact market Elvis was built to serve. Conformity culture punished the peacock. The man's scent was not allowed to make him stand out. It was meant to file him correctly. So fragrance became a sorting machine, and the sorting ran on a class. The drugstore staple, Old Spice, Aqua Vulva, said one thing: I am a regular man. I belong. Don't look twice. Then, in a single year, the industry built both ends of that sorting machine at once. 1964. And in 1964, Fabergé launched Brut, composed by Carl Mann, and sold it not through a beautiful actor, because an actor smelling good was still suspect, but through athletes. Joe Namath, Wilt Chamberlain, and later the boxer Henry Cooper telling Britain to splash it all over. That's the tell of the century. To give the ordinary man permission to smell of something, you needed a heavyweight whose masculinity was a matter of public record to stand there and vouch that it was allowed. Brut is not a perfume. Brut is a permission slip with vetiver in it, co-signed by a man who could knock you down. The same year, Estee Lauder launched Aramis. Aramis is composed by Bernard Shunt, and it sold it the opposite way. In the department store, first at Harrods, and it's, let me spray it on skin. Ooh. It's a leather chypre with a frank human warmth built in, named after a musketeer. Not the essence of man, a swordsman out of Dumas. Old Europe breeding. You know, Brut was for the man who works with his body and needs to be told it's permitted. Aramis was for the man who wants to be mistaken for someone whose money is older than he is. So inside one calendar year, the same gesture, a man buying him scent, forked cleanly by class. Which fork you reached for announced who you thought you were, and which fork you could afford announced who you actually were, and the two were not always the same man. And Elvis is the hinge because he could have bought anything, and he reached for the drugstore bottle, the same Old Spice as the gas station attendant. And his power was that he smelled like he belonged to the people who couldn't afford to climb. The boy who smelled like your brother and looked like a god. Notice, one floor up, who was selling the most aspirational masculinity on the counter? Estee Lauder. A woman building Aramis, selling men an idea of themselves they couldn't put into words. It keeps happening in the story. The masculinity is the product. The men are the market. The people deciding what a man should smell like are often the women, working above the men who think they are in charge. James Bond wore Floris 89, except James Bond never wore anything. Because James Bond was never alive. In every page Ian Fleming wrote, 007 never once puts on a scent, not once. But Fleming himself was a devout wearer of Florist number 89, the German street cologne from 1951, a clean, woody, sandalwood and citrus gentleman's scent, and somewhere along the line the author's own bottle migrated onto his fantasy of himself and hardened into legend. Bond wore number 89. Florists has dined on it for 70 years, and there's now a florist called number 007. Bond carries the cultural force because he is the moment the censor lost the war over the male body. And the war ran like this. The production code had governed what bodies could do on screen for 30 years. The separate beds, the foot kept on the floor, the kiss on a timer, with the erotic censored out of the picture. It had to go somewhere, and one of the places it was sent, because a film couldn't show you desire, but it could let a woman trail Shalimar through a doorway and let you understand everything. Smell became one of the few licensed carriers of the sex. The camera was forbidden. And then the code broke. In 1961, the Production Code Administration relented, and the apparatus loosened through the 60s until the rating systems replaced it in 1968. Right in the gap, in 1962, Dr. No put Sean Connery on a screen as a man allowed at last to be openly, commercially sexual. Bond is the licensed return of everything the code had spent 30 years sublimating into perfume and innuendo. The desire that had been smuggled in a bottle came roaring back as a man in a dinner jacket. The fragrance industry rode the loosening into its first real men's boom, which is where the 1964 bottles came from. The code had made scent the smuggler of everything that could not be said, and its collapse let the counter finally say it out loud. And what it said, through Bond, was that a man could be desired now, on purpose, for money. And the cruelest joke lives here. Bond, the freest, most sexually licensed man the culture produced, the end of the censor, never wore anything. The scent was assigned to him after the fact. Off his own author's shelf, and then sold back to the real men who wanted to smell like the freedom he represented. Even the man who broke the alibi was an alibi. Even the liberation was a product. One thing before I turn, and I will say it quietly, because it gets its own episode later. Look at the dates on all 5 of these bottles. Acqua di Parma, 1916. Yardley Lavender, the 1870s. Floris, 1951. Old Spice, the 30s. The most modern men of the age were wearing the barbershop of their grandfathers. Their cologne was older than their fathers. We'll come back to what it means that the newest people of any era reach backward for their smell. 5 men, 5 foxes, and every one of them on the defensive, sealed shut, hiding, branding himself, fitting in, or liberated by affection. Now watch a woman do the opposite. In the same 20 years, the contrast is the argument. Marlene Dietrich. Dietrich's signature was Bandit by Robert Piguet, 1944. And you know, Bandit is not a pretty thing. It's leather and bitterness and green. And it's the most aggressively masculine composition on the market in its day. It's a scent built like a slap, Marlene Dietrich didn't dab it. She didn't finish a shave with it. By the accounts that survive, she sprayed it across the stage before a performance into the air she was about to walk through with the air of a right. The woman who built her myth on a man's white tie and tails also wore a man's leather openly as a weapon in front of thousands and dared the room to find it unfeminine. And nobody handed Marlene Dietrich a permission slip. She didn't need a boxer to vouch for her, an author's shelf to borrow from, or a chore to hide behind. She walked into the most masculine scent in the building, and she made it hers in public. Put her next to the 5 men, and the inversion is total. McQueen sealed himself shut. Grant kept an excuse to hand. Sinatra branded himself. Elvis fitted in, and Bond was liberated by a fiction he didn't even choose. Dietrich, under far heavier rules about what a woman could be, picked up the most dangerous bottle on the shelf and aimed it. The men panic, the women aim. One loose thread before I go, because it becomes the spine of the next episode. The leather Dietrich sprayed across that stage was composed by one perfumer, a woman, an unclassifiable, trouser-wearing, scandalous woman whose name almost no one watching knows, and who turns out to be standing behind one of the most surprising male scents of the age as well. One knows both sides of the line, and her name waits for the next episode. And once you know it, you won't be able to unsee her. The alibi didn't end. Take that with you. So walk into any shop today and count the words on the men's counter. Cologne, aftershave, eau de toilette, pour homme, sport, intense, anything at all, except the word perfume. Because the word perfume is still, 60 years later, the one a man is not supposed to want. The 5 forces have changed costume. The psychology is now called self-care. The politics is quieter. The economics is influencer-shaped. And the class sorting runs through niche houses instead of drugstores. And the sense is gone. But the bottle still arrives wearing a cover story, and we are still, most of us, helping the men in our lives keep the lie tidy. The way I kept it tidy for a frightened man holding a French bottle 30 years ago. I told him it was an aftershave so he could wear the thing he wanted and keep his face. I have wondered ever since whether that was a kindness or whether I was one more person handing a man a cover story instead of letting him enjoy his own life. Subscribe if you're new here. Hit the notification bell, because the next episode is the one I promised you today. The woman who armed Marlene Dietrich and is said to have armed Marlon Brando too. One knows behind both sides of the line. The most important name the 20th century refused to print. Next week you finally learn it. You already know who I am, and you know whose tray this is. So the only thing worth saying, the men hid, the bottles didn't.